We're going to be talking about the controversial subject of the India-Pakistan partition. Now, ever since this partition has happened, these two countries, India and Pakistan, have several conflicting views on some things. Now, there's a lot of bias and misunderstanding of what happened. We don't take sides at all. So what you'll be getting is unbiased, undisputable facts of what actually happened. Now, this video is going to be divided up into 5 subsections, talking about the people, the assets, and the resources that had been divided since the partition, as well as we're going to touch on some points of conflicts that these countries have. So let's start off with a little bit of the history of the partition itself. Now, to start off, we have to talk about the fact that for almost 200 years, the Indian subcontinent was ruled by a British Raj. Raj is a Hindi form for reign. Most of India was directly under the British rule, 60% of the total area and as much as 75% of the total population. But there were a few hundred princely or native states that the British ruled indirectly. Now, at its height, the British Raj was made up of not just present-day India, with the exception of small Portuguese and French-owned territories, but was also made up of Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Myanmar, and also for a shorter period of time, Aden, now part of Yemen, and British Somaliland, which you can tell by the name is now part of Somalia. Now, when World War II ended, the British realized that they could no longer hold on to India, and in early 1947, Lord Louis Mountbatten, he was the last governing official of British India. He set a deadline for independence for August 15th, 1947. Now, on July 8th, the British lawyer Sir Cyril Radcliffe arrived in India with a plan that divided the Hindu majority lands from the Muslim majority ones. Then, in August of 1947, the British finally left after partitioning the Indian subcontinent into 2 separate nations, which were India and Pakistan. On August 14th, Pakistan became an independent country, but it faced several problems. One of those issues was that it never had natural borders such as a river, a sea, or some sort of mountain range. Also, Pakistan was divided up into 2 regions, and these 2 regions were West Pakistan and East Bengal. And those 2 regions were separated by about 1,000 miles of land that belonged to India. So as you could imagine, it was pretty difficult to govern a country where one land was over here and another part of the land was way over there. Now, also, when it came to drawing the borders, one of the big issues was that no amount of population distribution could perfectly divide the Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs. 62% of the area of undivided Punjab was given to India, along with 55% of the population. Now, the Punjab region was split into Punjab, Pakistan, and Punjab, India, following the independence and partition of the 2 countries back in 1947. Now, this border ran from Kashmir state south along the Uj River, leaving one sub-district of the Gurdaspur district to Pakistan and giving the rest all to India. And now, guys, before I continue, I want to know, what do you love about your country? Let me know down there, as well as if you are proud of your country, regardless of what your country is. Let me know by hitting the like button. Now let's talk about the refugees issue. Now, when Radcliffe's plan to make the division became public, a lot of violence and riots broke out all over the country. Now, the partition had left up to 1 million people dead and forced 20 million people to move one way or the other across the new border. So millions of people found themselves living in the wrong country and became victims of discriminatory attacks. People thought that if you're Muslim and wanted to be safe, you had to move to Pakistan. If you were non-Muslim, you had to go to India. Now, this led to one of the largest mass migrations in history. 5.3 million Hindus fled from Punjab and Sindh into India, and 5.9 Muslims fled from India into West Pakistan. Also, 3.3 Hindus fled East Bengal, and also 1.3 million Muslims fled from India into East Bengal. And more than 1 million refugees migrated from East Pakistan, which is now Bangladesh, to West Bengal in India. Now, on April 8th, 1950, there was a pact called the Delhi Pact. Now, this was signed in New Delhi, India by India's Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru and Pakistani's Prime Minister Liaquat Ali Khan. Now, the pact was to allow refugees to return safely to where they came from to take care of any unfinished business that they had, as well as all abducted women and stolen properties were supposed to be returned, and the pact also canceled out any forced religious conversions. Now let's talk about some of the assets that were divided up after the partition. Among other assets that had to be distributed were the wine cellars. and those would stay in India because Pakistan would be an Islamic state where alcohol is haram. However, Pakistan was supposed to be monetarily compensated for its share of the value of the wine. Now, at the time, there was only one government press that printed the money, and India did not want to hand that over. So when Pakistan began its existence, it used the Indian currency and stamped the name Pakistan over India. Now, in terms of the military, this was one of the major issues because at first the British were reluctant to divide up the forces, but eventually it was agreed that they would split this 36% and 44% between Pakistan and India respectively. Now, the soldiers were given freedom to join whichever country they wanted, so Muslim forces went to Pakistan and non-Muslim forces went to India. Now, the thing is, now in Pakistan's army, their army of 150,000 men needed 4,000 officers, but there were only 2,500 trained Muslim officers. So Pakistan did what it had to do, and it had to take about 500 British soldiers for the time being. Now we move on into the Kashmir controversy. So the tricky part of the 1,800-mile line dividing Pakistan and India laid north of Punjab, and this used to be the princely state of Kashmir. And its ruler had to decide whether to join India or Pakistan after independence. Now, the state had a mostly Muslim population, but a Hindu ruler who wanted to keep Kashmir independent. And because of this, a rebellion broke out and caused the king, Maharaja Heer Singh, to ask for India's help. This resulted with Kashmir joining India. Now, the war broke out between the two countries over this in 1948, and again in 1965, and also again in 1999. The Indo-Pakistan War of 1947 to 1948 created a state called Azad Jammu and Kashmir, also known as AJK, which is a self-governing administrative division of Pakistan. Now, most of Kashmir at this point is India held, while Pakistan holds the eastern portion, and depending on who you're talking to, the map of India and Pakistan could vary. Now, this is because the line that divides the two countries, it's not actually an international border determined by officials, but rather it's considered a line of control which was the result of a ceasefire. And the fifth point of controversy that we're going to look at is the Siachen Glacier. Now, to further complicate things, there's also a line of actual control in the Indian subcontinent's high north, dividing the territory that is held by India but sometimes claimed by Pakistan from territory held by China but claimed by India. Yeah, pretty tricky. Hopefully you got that. Now, this area is called Aksai Chin, and it was occupied by China during the brief Sino-Indian War in 1962. Now, India and Pakistan agreed to respect the line of control by the Simla Agreement in 1972, but this document actually left out the Siachen Glacier, which India then occupied in 1984. And occasionally battles have began over this area, and the Siachen Glacier is a great place to have because it's considered the largest single source of fresh water on the Indian subcontinent, and it's also the highest battleground in the world. And the Indian soldiers there are at 21,000 feet above sea level. Now, it serves India's interest to guard this glacier, since this glacier prevents a direct link between Pakistan and China. I'm going to be looking at several points in history where India and Pakistan had notable conflicts and the causes behind those conflicts. Now, the wars that came after the independence tainted the relationships between the two countries, as well as it triggered a lot of hatred from both sides. 70 years and 4 wars after, it's quite clear that India and Pakistan don't have the best of friendships. Politically speaking, for decades, Indians have accused Pakistan of state-sponsored terrorism, and Pakistan has accused India of supporting ethnic separatism. Now, the first point of conflict that I want to examine is Kashmir. Now, again, I covered the Kashmir dispute a lot in part 1, so if you want a little bit more detail as well, gotta watch part 1. But for the sake of this episode, I gotta rehash some of the facts about the Kashmir dispute. The major dispute between Kashmir is who does it belong to, India or Pakistan? Kashmir used to be an independent state whose ruler had to decide whether he would join India or Pakistan. When rebellion broke out, the ruler took help from the Indian government. India chose to help, but only on one condition: Kashmir must become a part of India. This resulted in 3 major wars between India and Pakistan, one in 1948 and again in 1965 and in 1999. Now, let's take a look at some of these wars in a little bit more detail. The Indo-Pakistani War, also known as the First Kashmir War, this was a war that was started when the ruler of Kashmir, Raja Hari Singh, decided to join India. Jammu and Kashmir were the largest of the princely states with a majority Muslim population ruled by an Indian king. The tribal forces, with support from the army of Pakistan, attacked and occupied parts of the state. Hari Singh saw no other option other than to take support from India. The UN was then forced to step in and a ceasefire was achieved temporarily. After considerable efforts, the UN Commission was forced to declare a failure of Resolution 47 in December of 1949. Indian losses were 1,500 people killed and 3,500 wounded, whereas Pakistan lost over 6,000 people and there was 14,000 people wounded. India gained control of 2/3 of Kashmir, whereas Pakistan gained roughly 1/3 of Kashmir. Most neutral assessments of the war conclude that India may have been the victor of the war, as it was able to hold on to 2/3 of Kashmir, including the Kashmir Valley, Jammu and Ladakh. This war created the state of Azad Jammu and Kashmir, known as AJK, which is a self-governing administrative division of Pakistan. Now, what you need to note about these wars is that based on who you asked, that will determine which side won the war, because the factors that go into winning a war aren't necessarily very clear, because what it means to actually win a war is often debatable. Does it mean you won the war because you killed more of the enemy's men versus the amount of people that they killed on your side? Or did you conquer more land, so therefore you won the war? But let's move on to the Indo-Pakistani War of 1965. The 1965 war was a direct result of something called Operation Gibraltar. Operation Gibraltar was carried out by Pakistani armed forces in order to occupy Kashmir. If successful, Pakistan hoped to gain control over Kashmir, but the operation didn't achieve the results they hoped for. Now, in case you're wondering why they called it Operation Gibraltar, that was a code name that referred to the Arab invasion of Spain, which was launched from Port Gibraltar. Now, in August of 1965, the Pakistani army entered Jammu and Kashmir from Pakistan disguised as locals, but the strategy didn't work and people soon knew that they were infiltrators. This sparked the Indo-Pakistani War of 1965. India retaliated with a full-scale military attack. The war lasted 17 days. The war ended only after diplomatic interventions by the Soviet Union and the United States. Now, just to give you a little bit of idea of how tense things got, a lot of people tend to focus on the wars of 1947, 1971, and 1999, but the 1965 war is often forgotten about. Now, in 2015, it marked the golden anniversary, or the 50th anniversary of that war, and Pakistan, as well as India, claimed to be the winners of that war. Now let's move on to 1971. This war wasn't related to Kashmir at all, but the ongoing wars between East and West Pakistan was why these two countries fought again in 1971. Bangladesh, formerly known as East Pakistan, wanted to be an independent country. And I mean understandably so, because East and West Pakistan was separated by a large mass of India. India was right in the middle between Pakistan and currently what is known as Bangladesh. So the people of East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, to them it made no sense to be part of Pakistan. India supported the Bangladeshi cause and formally entered into war with Pakistan. The war lasted 13 days and there was the largest number of prisoners of wars taken captive since World War II. The war ended with the independence of East Pakistan and the creation of the People's Republic of Bangladesh. Continuing on through history in the year 1984, and in part 1 I did cover the conflict of the Saichen Glacier in a little bit more detail, so I'm not going to go into too much detail in this part, but just to give you guys a backdrop, India launched an operation known as Meghdoot to gain control over the Saichen Glacier. This is followed by the Pakistani army launching strikes on several occasions in 1985, 1987, and 1995. The Saichen Glacier is the highest battleground on Earth, and both India and Pakistan maintain permanent military presence in the region at a height of over 6,000 meters. That's roughly 20,000 feet. The two countries have been fighting over the glacier since 1984. More than 2,000 people have died on the glacier, mostly due to the extreme weather as well as other risks of fighting so high up. Continuing into the year of 1999, the last battle between India and Pakistan, and an especially important one, was the Kargil War of 1999. The war took place immediately after the Pakistani army infiltrated the Kargil district in Kashmir. The Indian army fought back with all its might to drive out the Pakistani infiltrators, and within 2 months, India was able to regain most of its territory. Pressured by the international communities, Pakistan was forced to withdraw its troops from the area. So although 1999 was the last huge military battle between these two countries, the conflicts between the two countries still continue, and even in the past decades we notice some of this. And especially throughout history, we do see times where there is peace and then all of a sudden overnight things change. The past few years saw a rise in cultural collaboration between India and Pakistan, where Bollywood stars appeared in commercials on Pakistani TV. Musicians from both countries were seen collaborating. Coke Studio and Pakistani TV shows were becoming very popular in India. However, tensions renewed in the summer of 2016. There arose protests in Kashmir against Indian security forces. Add to the fact that there were very violent attacks on an Indian army base in Kashmir that was followed by a surgical strike by India on Pakistan. It was called the deadliest attack on security forces in Kashmir in 2 decades. As a result of the attack, 19 Indian soldiers were killed. India's Home Minister Rajnath Singh tweeted this shortly after. Pakistan is a terrorist state and it should be identified and isolated as such. Yeah, and the Indian political party, Navnirman Sena, also known as the MNS, issued a 48-hour ultimatum to Pakistani artists working in Bollywood to leave India or the MNS would punish them. The popular film director Karan John was on the brink of releasing his film A Dil Hai Mushkil around this time, which went on to become a big success, but the MNS had threatened to not let him release the video. Why? It was because the Pakistani actor Fawad Khan played a small role in the movie. After this, many actors agreed not to work with Pakistanis until tensions between the two countries died down.